The neon lights of Seoul were just beginning to flicker against the rain-slicked pavement when the delivery girl's world shattered. She stood paralyzed in front of it, the limited edition $550,000 Ferrari that the city's elite called the Black Throne. Behind the wheel was a man whose name made the city's shadows tremble, Park Sung-woo, the legendary Shadow King of the Korean Mafia. As his enforcers stepped out of their SUVs, hands moving toward their jackets, the girl in the mud-splattered pink hoodie collapsed to her knees. Her voice broke as she stared at the jagged silver scratch on the pristine black door. "I can't pay you, even if I gave you my whole life." The entire street went silent. No one ever admitted they couldn't pay Park Sung-woo. But instead of the violence everyone expected, the most feared man in Seoul knelt in the dirty street water and whispered 3 words that would trigger a bloody internal coup. "Get in. Stay with me until the end, because the truth behind why this mafia boss chose mercy over money will leave you speechless." Before we continue, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Her name was Choi Jia, and at 19, she was the primary provider for a family that the city of Seoul had forgotten. Born in a cramped semi-basement apartment where the smell of damp concrete never left, Jia's days were a blur of delivery apps and exhaust fumes. Since her parents had disappeared under the weight of debt 3 years ago, she had become a mother, a father, and a shield for her 2 younger siblings. Life for Jia was measured in 1 per delivery, and today, the math wasn't adding up. The winter rain had made the mountain roads of the rich districts deadly, and her scooter's brakes were as tired as she was. Across from her was Park Sung-woo. He lived in a world of silk suits and no-mercy debt collections. He was a man who had built an empire on the belief that empathy was a fatal flaw. But as he looked at Jia's shaking, calloused hands, he didn't see a girl who had damaged his car. He saw a mirror of a starving orphan who had once stood on a similar street corner 30 years ago, waiting for a predator to strike. By telling her to get in, Sung-woo wasn't just giving a girl a ride. He was declaring war on his own syndicate's rules, and his rivals were already watching from the shadows. The silence that followed the crash was more deafening than the screech of metal had been. It was the kind of silence that only exists in the presence of absolute power. Pedestrians who had been rushing home under black umbrellas froze in their tracks, their eyes darting from the shattered plastic of the scooter to the jagged, silver scar on the door of the Ferrari. In Gangnam, everyone knew that car. They knew the license plate, and they knew the man who sat behind the tinted glass. Choi Jia remained on the asphalt, the cold rain soaking through her pink hoodie until it felt like a lead weight against her skin. Her knees were scraped, and her delivery bag had burst open, spilling containers of spicy rice cakes into the gutter. But she didn't feel the pain. Her entire world had narrowed down to that one mark on the door, a 5-inch gash that represented more money than she would see in a lifetime of deliveries. The door of the Ferrari opened with a slow, deliberate click. A pair of polished leather shoes stepped into the murky street water, followed by the tall, imposing figure of Park Sung-woo. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He stood there for a moment, adjusting the cuff of his charcoal suit, his bearded face a mask of terrifying calm. Behind him, the doors of the 3 trailing SUVs flew open in unison. A dozen men in dark coats swarmed out, forming a wall of muscle and suppressed violence around the scene. The lead enforcer, a man with a jagged scar across his brow, reached into his jacket, his eyes fixed on Jia as if she were a threat to be eliminated. Jia looked up, her vision blurred by tears and the stinging rain. She saw the Shadow King looming over her, his silhouette framed by the harsh neon glow of a nearby billboard. To the rest of Seoul, he was a monster, a man who built an empire on the broken bones of those who couldn't pay their debts. To Jia, in this moment, he was the executioner. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking as she pressed her forehead toward the wet pavement in a desperate bow. "I'm so sorry. My brakes, the rain. I'll work. I'll do anything. Please." Sung-woo didn't look at the car. He didn't even glance at the ruined door that would cost a fortune to replace. His dark, piercing eyes were fixed on Jia's hands, red, raw, and shaking as she clutched the wet asphalt. He saw the faded fabric of her cheap hoodie and the way her small frame trembled against the onslaught of the storm. For a heartbeat, the coldness in his gaze wavered. He didn't see a clumsy girl. He saw a ghost from his own past, standing on a corner just like this one, waiting for the world to show a mercy it didn't possess. The enforcer stepped forward, his voice a low growl. "Boss, should we take her?" Sung-woo didn't answer him. Instead, he took a step toward the girl, the water splashing beneath his boots, and the city held its breath to see if the Shadow King would finally break. The rain intensified, turning the street into a blur of gray and neon, but Jia didn't move. She remained bowed, her forehead almost touching the freezing pavement, her tears mixing with the rainwater. Every second of silence felt like a heavy stone being added to a pile on her back. She knew the cost of a single rim on a car like this, let alone a door panel made of custom carbon fiber. It was a number so large it didn't even feel real. It was a death sentence written in Italian paint. "I can't pay," she sobbed, the words finally breaking free from her throat. "I have nothing. My scooter is on a payment plan. My siblings, we have nothing." She looked up then, her face a mask of absolute devastation. In a moment of pure, panicked honesty, she reached out toward the hem of his charcoal coat before drawing her hand back in terror. "If you need a life to pay for it, take mine. I'll work for you until I die. I'll do anything. Just don't hurt my family. Please." The men in black suits shifted, their faces hardening. In their world, a debt was a debt, and weakness was an invitation to strike. The lead enforcer reached for Jia's arm, ready to drag her away from the boss's path, but a single, sharp raise of Sung-woo's hand froze him in place. Sung-woo stepped closer. The water splashed beneath his boots, a rhythmic, haunting sound in the quiet street. He looked down at the girl, really looked at her. He didn't see the scratch on his car. He saw the way she clutched her thin, soaked hoodie. He saw the raw, red skin of her knuckles, a sign of someone who worked 18-hour days just to stay standing. Most of all, he saw her eyes. 30 years vanished in a heartbeat. Suddenly, Sung-woo wasn't the Shadow King of Seoul. He was a 10-year-old boy standing in a frozen alleyway, holding a stolen loaf of bread, looking up at a man who held the power of life and death in his hands. He remembered that exact flavor of terror, the realization that you are worth less than the dirt on a rich man's shoe. He remembered the desperate wish for just one person to see him as a human being instead of a nuisance. His heart, a piece of granite he had spent decades hardening, developed a microscopic crack. The girl wasn't just a delivery driver who had been careless. She was a mirror of the soul he had buried under mountains of cold steel and blood. He didn't yell. He didn't call his lawyer. He didn't order his men to take her to the collection rooms. Instead, he reached out a gloved hand and placed it firmly on her trembling shoulder. The touch was surprisingly steady, a sudden anchor in the middle of her storm. "Stop crying," he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that seemed to command the very rain to listen. "The car is just metal. But a life is a debt I don't feel like collecting today." The heavy silence of the street was broken only by the rhythmic clicking of the Ferrari's cooling engine and the soft splash of rain against the asphalt. The enforcers stood like statues, their confusion masked by professional stoicism, though their eyes betrayed them. They were waiting for the order to seize her, to calculate the damages, or to make an example of the girl who had dared to scar the Shadow King's pride. Instead, Sung-woo reached past her and opened the passenger door. The interior glowed with a soft, amber ambient light, smelling of expensive leather and cedar, a world away from the grease and wet exhaust of Jia's daily life. "Get in," he said. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a royal decree. Jia looked up, her eyes wide and rimmed with red. She looked at the pristine, cream-colored seat and then back at her own soaked, mud-streaked hoodie. I'll ruin the seat, sir. I'm filthy." "The seats can be replaced," Sung-woo replied, his gaze never wavering. "A human being freezing to death in the rain cannot." "Get in." With trembling legs, Jia slid into the car. The door closed with a muted, pressurized thud that silenced the roar of the Seoul traffic. Outside, the lead enforcer stepped toward the window, his face a mask of disbelief. He tapped twice on the glass, but Sung-woo didn't lower it. He simply shifted the car into gear, the powerful engine purring beneath them like a restrained beast. He didn't look back at his convoy or his men. He simply drove. The ride through the city was a study in absolute stillness. Jia sat as small as possible, her hands folded in her lap, afraid that if she moved, she might wake up from this terrifying dream. She watched the neon lights of Gangnam blur past the window, luxury boutiques, soaring glass towers, and the faces of people who would never know what it was like to choose between a meal and a bus fare. Sung-woo drove with a relaxed, singular focus. He didn't ask for her address. He didn't need to. He simply navigated the labyrinth of the city toward the darker, cramped alleys where the neon didn't shine quite as bright. No words were exchanged, yet the atmosphere inside the cabin had shifted. The predatory tension that usually followed the Shadow King had been replaced by a heavy, protective gravity. As they crossed the bridge, the city lights reflecting off the Han River like scattered diamonds, Jia stole a glance at the man beside her. His profile was carved from granite, but his grip on the steering wheel was loose, almost gentle. In that shared silence, a silent pact was being forged. Sung-woo wasn't just driving a girl home. He was crossing a line his syndicate had drawn in blood decades ago. He was choosing a person over his reputation, and as the Ferrari glided into the shadows of the lower districts, they both knew that by the time the sun rose, the city would never look the same again. The Ferrari came to a halt at the mouth of a narrow, crumbling alleyway in the Mapo district, a place where the shadows felt heavier than the rain. Sung-woo watched through the windshield as Jia stepped out of the car, her silhouette small and frail against the backdrop of rusted metal stairs and flickering street lamps. She bowed one last time, a deep, trembling gesture of gratitude, before disappearing into the darkness of a semi-basement apartment. He didn't drive away. Instead, he made a single phone call. Within an hour, a digital file arrived on his encrypted tablet. As the city slept, Sung-woo sat in the silent luxury of his car, scrolling through the life of the girl in the pink hoodie. The data was a cold, clinical ledger of suffering. Both parents are gone, taken by a mountain road and a debt they couldn't outrun. 2 younger siblings, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6. A mountain of medical bills for the youngest's chronic asthma. Sung-woo felt a familiar, bitter taste in his mouth. He knew this ledger by heart. It was the same one the world had used to keep him underwater decades ago. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the small, neighborhood pharmacy at the end of the block. The pharmacist, a weary man behind plexiglass, began to stutter when he saw the man in the charcoal suit, but Sung-woo simply placed a black titanium card on the counter. "The prescriptions for the Choi family," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Pay them in full. For the next 3 years. If they run out, you call this number. If you mention my name to her, you won't need a pharmacy anymore." His next stop was a cramped office above a local laundromat. The landlord, a man with greedy eyes and a smell of cheap cigarettes, was halfway through a thread about eviction by morning, when Sung-woo's shadow filled the doorway. The man's bravado evaporated instantly. Sung-woo didn't speak a word. He merely tossed a thick, silk-wrapped envelope onto the desk. It contained enough cash to buy the entire building, let alone the rent for a damp basement. "The debt of Choi Jia is settled," Sung-woo stated, his eyes boring into the landlord's soul. "From this moment on, you are her guardian. If a single pipe leaks, if the heater fails for an hour, or if you so much as raise your voice to those children, I will consider it a personal insult." As he walked back to his scarred Ferrari, Sung-woo felt the weight of his own empire pressing against his shoulders. He was a man who lived by the code of taking. Yet as he looked at the dark window of the basement apartment, he realized he had never felt more powerful than he did in this moment of giving. He was the ghost of the city, haunting the ledgers of the poor to erase their pain. But he knew the blood he had spilled to get this power would eventually demand its own payment. He was protecting a family, but in doing so, he was painting a target on his own back. While the air in the Mapo district was thick with the scent of rain and redemption, the atmosphere at the syndicate's headquarters was cold, clinical, and sharp with the smell of betrayal. In a dimly lit boardroom overlooking the glowing arteries of Seoul, General Han sat at the head of a mahogany table, his eyes fixed on a security feed. Han had been Sung-woo's shadow for 15 years, a man who measured loyalty in profit margins and calculated fear. To him, the image on the screen was not an act of mercy. It was a death warrant for their empire. He watched the grainy footage of the Ferrari, the legendary Black Throne, idling in a gutter while the most feared man in South Korea played the part of a benefactor to a delivery girl. He saw this Shadow King personally visiting a local pharmacy and a low-life landlord. For Han, every step Sung-woo took in those muddy backstreets was a step away from the throne. "He's lost the scent of blood," Han whispered, his voice like dry parchment. Around him, a handful of lieutenants shifted uncomfortably, their faces caught between old habits of obedience and a new, rising greed. "He's become a grandfather before his time. He's trading our reputation for a girl in a pink hoodie." Han reached out and picked up a secure burner phone. This was the line he had sworn never to touch, the direct link to the rival families of the Busan Circle and the northern factions. They were men who had been waiting for years for a crack in the Shadow King's armor, a single moment of sentimentality they could exploit. "It's time," Han said as the call connected, his eyes narrowing as he watched Sung-woo's car finally pull away from the alley. The king is no longer looking at the crown. He's looking at the sidewalk. He's vulnerable. The voice on the other end was a low, guttural rasp, filled with the hunger of a predator that had finally found a scent. "And the girl? She is the anchor," Han replied, a cruel smile finally touching his lips. "And we are going to use her to drown him." As Han hung up, he looked back at the screen. To the world, Park Sung-woo was still the man to be feared. But to General Han and the wolves he had just invited to the feast, the boss was now just a man with something to lose. The internal clock of the syndicate had begun to tick, and with every heartbeat, the peace Sung-woo had bought for Jia was drawing the storm closer to them both. The war wasn't coming from the streets anymore. It was coming from the very seats of power Sung-woo had built. The following Tuesday, the rain had finally slowed to a persistent, icy mist that clung to the neon signs of the city. Jia sat on her new scooter, a modest but reliable replacement that had appeared outside her apartment with the keys in the ignition and no note. Her heart felt lighter than it had in years. Her siblings were fed. The landlord had suddenly become the most polite man in Seoul, and the crushing weight of debt had vanished as if by a magician's hand. When her phone buzzed with a high-priority delivery notification, she didn't hesitate. The order was for a luxury penthouse in a secluded district on the edge of the city, a place where the mountain woods began to swallow the skyscrapers. The payout was unusually high, a generosity she attributed to the wealthy residents of the hills. She didn't notice the black sedan that pulled out from the shadows of her alley as she started her engine, nor did she see the cold, calculating eyes of General Han watching her through a tinted window blocks away. As she navigated the winding, lightless roads leading to the estate, the city's hum began to fade, replaced by the eerie rustle of wet pines. She pulled up to the gated entrance, but the intercom remained silent. The gates were already ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. A sense of unease finally pricked at her skin. This wasn't a residential delivery. The house at the end of the drive was dark, its windows like empty eye sockets. Before she could turn the scooter around, the blinding glare of high beams cut through the mist behind her. Two heavy SUVs surged forward, pinning her against the iron gates. Men stepped out, but they weren't the Shadow King's men. Their suits were different, their faces marked by the hungry desperation of the Busan Circle. In the center of the syndicate's war room, General Han watched a red dot on a digital map come to a halt. He picked up his phone and dialed Sung-woo's private line. "The girl is at the old Namsan estate," Han said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "The Busan family is currently deciding what her life is worth. They want to know if the Shadow King still values his territory, or if he's traded his crown for a delivery girl's safety. They're giving you 20 minutes to choose, boss. Come alone and sign over the port docks, or let the debt be collected from her instead." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute, a void that seemed to suck the air out of the room. Han smiled, waiting for the sound of a man breaking. He had set the perfect trap, certain that whether Sung-woo came or stayed, the Shadow King was already dead. He didn't realize that by threatening the only light left in Sung-woo's world, He hadn't found a weakness. He had unleashed a monster that no longer had anything to hold him back. The roar of the Ferrari's engine was no longer a purr. It was a scream that tore through the mountain mist. Sung-woo didn't bring a convoy. He didn't call for backup. He drove with a cold, singular focus that blurred the trees into ghostly streaks of green. He knew Han was watching the GPS, expecting a surrender, but Sung-woo had spent his life proving that a cornered predator is the most dangerous thing in the world. He reached the Namsan estate, just as the Busan enforcers were dragging Jia toward the dark maw of the main house. The Ferrari didn't slow down. It breached the iron gates like a kinetic shell, tires churning the gravel into a hail of stones. Before the dust could settle, Sung-woo was out of the car, his movements fluid and lethal. He didn't offer words. He offered the kind of violence that had earned him the title of Shadow King. He reached Jia just as the first wave of gunfire erupted from the upper balcony. The air filled with the sharp, metallic tang of cordite and the shattering of glass. In that split second, the man who had never sacrificed a single drop of blood for anyone did the unthinkable. He didn't dive for cover. He didn't reach for his weapon. Sung-woo lunged forward, his large frame eclipsing Jia's small, trembling body. He pulled her against his chest, tucking her head under his chin as the world exploded around them. A hail of leads slammed into the side of the Ferrari and the stone pillars behind them. He felt the hot sear of a bullet grazing his shoulder and the sting of glass shards pepper-spraying his back, but he didn't flinch. He held her with a grip that was both iron and protective, a human shield built of charcoal wool and scars. "Don't look," he hissed into her hair, his voice vibrating with a primal intensity she had never heard. "Keep your eyes closed, Jia. I have you." For Jia, the world was a terrifying cacophony of screams and thunder, but inside the circle of Sung-woo's arms, there was a strange, impossible stillness. She could feel his heart hammering against her ear, not with fear, but with the steady, rhythmic beat of a war drum. Blood began to soak through the back of his expensive suit, dripping onto the wet gravel, but Sung-woo didn't let go. He shielded her from the flying debris and the sight of the men falling around them as his own loyalists, who had followed him in secret despite Han's orders, finally descended upon the estate. The road war had turned into a slaughter, but as the smoke began to swirl in the mountain air, the only thing that mattered to the Shadow King was the fact that the girl in his arms was still breathing. He had paid the first installment of his debt in blood, and for the first time in 30 years, he felt no regret for the cost. The following morning, the sun struggled to pierce through the heavy clouds over Seoul, but for Park Sung-woo, the world had never looked clearer. He stood on the balcony of his private estate, his shoulder bandaged and his ribs aching, watching the city awaken. Down in the courtyard, his mechanics were assessing the Ferrari. The black throne was a wreck, riddled with bullet holes, its windows shattered, and that original 5-inch scratch now joined by a dozen others. To his men, it was a tragedy of lost value. To Sung-woo, it was just a piece of metal that had finally served a purpose. General Han was gone, purged along with the dissenters in a night of swift, cold efficiency. But as Sung-woo looked at his hands, he realized the satisfaction he felt didn't come from the victory over his rivals. It came from the memory of Jia's safety. For 20 years, he had built his empire on calculated violence. He had treated power like a math equation, subtracting enemies and adding fear to maintain the balance. It was a business strategy that had made him rich, but it had left his soul as hollow as the glass towers he owned. He had lived for the bottom line, believing that mercy was a luxury he couldn't afford. Now, he understood that he had been wrong. He realized that calculated violence could only buy him a throne, but uncalculated mercy was what built a legacy. The fear he had cultivated for decades had vanished the moment Han saw a crack in the armor, but the loyalty he had earned by shielding a delivery girl was something no coup could touch. He saw it in the eyes of the young guards downstairs, men who had previously followed him out of terror, but who now stood taller, moved by the sight of a king who would bleed for the smallest among them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, wrinkled delivery receipt he had found in the back of the Ferrari. It was Jia's. He looked at the meager amount she had been working for, pennies compared to the millions he moved every hour. Power, he finally understood, wasn't about how much you could take from the world. It was about how much you could protect from it. He had spent a lifetime being a predator, but the scratch on a $550,000 car had forced him to become a guardian. As he watched the first light of dawn hit the Han River, the Shadow King made a silent vow. He would no longer be the man who owned the city's shadows. He would be the man who made sure the children in the semi-basements didn't have to fear them. His business was still the syndicate, but his legacy would be the lives he saved when it didn't make sense to save them. The seasons in Seoul shifted, the icy rains of winter giving way to the soft, pale pink of cherry blossoms. But the Ferrari in the center of Park Sung-woo's garage remained unchanged. His mechanics had offered a dozen times to replace the door, to sand down the jagged silver gash and restore the car to its former glory. Each time, the Shadow King dismissed them with a sharp wave of his hand. To the rest of the world, the scratch was a blemish, a sign of a high-speed error or a moment of carelessness. To Sung-woo, it was the most beautiful thing he owned. He stood in the quiet of the garage, his fingers tracing the rough edge of the metal. The $550,000 car was no longer a throne, it was a monument. It reminded him of the night the air smelled of wet asphalt and spicy rice cakes. The night a girl in a mud-splattered pink hoodie had looked at him not with the calculated fear of a businessman, but with the raw, desperate hope of a child. Jia didn't deliver food anymore. With Sung-woo's silent backing, she had enrolled in a vocational college. Her siblings moved into a bright apartment where the sun actually reached the floorboards. Occasionally, a black SUV would park a block away from her school, and Sung-woo would watch from behind tinted glass as she walked her siblings home, her head held high, no longer scanning the shadows for predators. He never approached her. He didn't need a thank you. The debt had been settled in a currency the syndicate would never understand. The scratch had been the most expensive mistake of Jia's life, but it had been the most profitable investment of his. It had cost him a car, a loyal general, and the cold comfort of his anonymity, but in exchange, it had saved his soul. He had realized that a man who is only feared is eventually forgotten, but a man who protects is immortalized in the hearts of those he shields. As he prepared to leave for a meeting with the city's new council, a meeting about community centers rather than dock territory, he took one last look at the scarred Ferrari. He realized that the jagged silver line wasn't just a mark on a car door. It was a crack in the wall he had built around his heart, a crack that had finally let the light in. The Shadow King climbed into the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life with a sound that no longer felt like a threat, and drove out into the sunlight of a city that was finally beginning to feel like home. Sometimes, the things we think are broken are the very things that make us whole.